Gap didn't hire a new CMO. They hired a chief entertainment officer. That decision tells you more about the future of marketing than any trend report released this year. This is not a conversation about content creators or platform. It's a conversation about why marketing and entertainment are quietly becoming the same system and what happens to the brands that do not notice. To understand why, we need to look at how ownership, production, and audience relationships are being reorganized right now. Welcome to Vision Voices podcast for founders and marketing leaders navigating new media with context, not chaos. I'm your host, Lara, and here we explore emerging platforms and cultural shifts to understand what really mean for business, not to chase trends, but to decide which ones deserve attention, budget, and belief. The reason this topic matters now is not because marketing suddenly needs to be more creative, or because new platforms have appeared, or because creators are having a particularly visible moment. It matters because the language many brands still use to think about marketing no longer matches the language the global media industry is using to shape attention. For a long time, marketing frameworks were built around relatively stable assumptions. Brands created campaigns, selected channels, measured reach, and optimized performance. Entertainment lived outside the organization, and marketing borrowed attention from it when needed. That framework is breaking down. A recent signal makes this visible. Gap has hired a chief entertainment officer, not a chief marketing officer, and not a head of content. A chief entertainment officer. That title signals a recognition that entertainment is no longer an outside activity. It is becoming a strategic function tied to brands maintain relevance and identity over time. Gap is not saying it needs better campaigns. It is saying that the environment in which meaning is created has changed. At the same time, the global media industry is restructuring at an infrastructure level. Streaming platforms are acquiring studios. Creators are building production companies. YouTube is formalizing studio-scale economics. These are not surface trends. They are shifts in how stories are owned and sustained. The risk for brands, especially in B2B and enterprise environment, is not simply falling behind the formats. The deeper risk is linguistic and cultural misalignment. Brands continue to speak the frameworks that no longer reflect how their markets experience meaning. When that gap grows, message lose coherence, stories fragment, and identity weakens. To understand what's changing, we need to start with ownership. When Netflix explores deeper integration with large-scale studios, assets such as Warner Brothers, level intellectual property, the significance is not in the size of the catalog. Netflix already controls global distribution, recommendation systems, and direct audiences relationship. What it has historically lacked is deep ownership of long-lived franchises developed entirely within its own organizational system. In the past, Netflix relied heavily on licensing and commissioning from external studios. That model enabled rapid global scale, but also meant that some of the most valuable intellectual property ultimately belonged elsewhere. What becomes possible now is the closed-loop system in which stories are created, distributed, and extended under a single strategic logic. This signals a shift in how power is organized in the attention economy. When distribution platforms move upstream into ownership, entertainment and marketing stop functioning as separate stages. The same system that produces stories also builds long-term cultural relevance. This pattern becomes clearer when we look beyond just one company. After acquiring MGM, Amazon didn't treat the studio as a traditional content supplier. Instead, Amazon has increasingly commissioned projects from creator adjustment studios, tested formats that originated on open platforms, and used YouTube native talent as early indicators of IP potential. Historically, studios developed ideas internally and tested them through pilots. Amazon has begun revising that sequence. Audience validation happens first, often through creator ecosystem, and studio scale investment follows. This approach reduces risk and shortens development cycle. A slower but related shift can be seen at Disney, which has piloted creator-driven initiatives and internal labs, particularly for younger audiences. While Disney remains conservative, the change in framing is meaningful. Creators are increasingly viewed as potential sources of future intellectual property, not just promotional partners, compared to the past when platform dependence was seen as a strength. Those moves signal a new priority. Distribution alone is no longer enough. Long-term relevance depends on owning stories rather than renting access to them. The same structural logic is visible from the opposite direction on YouTube. For most of its history, YouTube optimized for individual creators producing frequent uploads. Monetization rewarded volume and responsiveness to the algorithm. Over the past 2 years, YouTube has publicly increased funding for long-form, multi-episode series, introduced monetization structures designed for studio-scale production, and supported creators operating with permanent teams, writers' rooms, and recurring formats. This marks a clear departure from the past. Creators who wanted to operate like studios previously had to leave the platform or rely on external financing. Now the platform itself is designed for studio economics. The signal is economic, not cultural. YouTube is no longer optimizing for individual videos. It is optimizing for repeatable intellectual property. That positions creators not as edge cases, but as a foundational layer of the media system. For brands, this changes what participation looks like. YouTube is no longer just a distribution channel for campaigns. It is increasingly a place where enduring entertainment assets are built. This evolution becomes concrete when we look at MrBeast. Industry reporting now consistently frames MrBeast as a multi-vertical production company rather than an individual creator. His operating spans videos, consumer brands, licensing and live formats, supported by large teams and long-term infrastructure. At this point, the scale is comparable to a mid-sized studio. In the past, building a studio of this size required access to traditional distribution, finances, and gatekeepers. What is possible now is the opposite sequence. Audience proximity comes first. The intellectual property emerges from that relationship. This matters because it demonstrates that audience relationships have become a form of a strategic capital. Creator-led studios move faster because their feedback loops are shorter and their incentives are directly aligned with audience response. For brands, this is not about imitation. It's about recognizing that attention compounds differently when it's owned rather than rented. Taken together, these developments point to a reorganization of how attention is produced and sustained. On the one side, platforms like Netflix and Amazon are moving upstream into IP ownership. On the other hand, creators are moving downstream into studio-scale production. On both cases, the logic is the same: control production and distribution, and you gain leverage in the attention economy. In the past, marketing sat on top of entertainment. Brands could remain culturally present by buying access. What is emerging now is a system where entertainment itself is the infrastructure through which meaning flows. Many established brands are highly efficient but structurally misaligned with the reality. They optimize campaigns while attention compounds elsewhere. They treat entertainment as a tactic rather than a capability. The strategic question is no longer about content volume or a channel mix. It's about whether a brand owns any durable narrative system on its own, or whether it remains dependent on platforms whose incentives are not aligned with its identity. That distinction will increasingly determine which brands compound relevance over time and which ones are forced to keep buying it back. For marketers and brand builders, the lesson is clear. Entertainment is not a tactic you add at the end. It's the infrastructure through which cultural attention flows. And the real strategic question now is not whether you create content, but whether you own the story or depend on someone else to carry it for you.